Out of these troubled times, our fifth objective, a new world order can emerge, a new era, freer from the threat of terror, stronger in the pursuit of justice, and more secure in the quest for peace. An era in which the nations of the world, East and West, North and South, can prosper and live in harmony. Wars raged across the span of human endeavor. And today that new world is struggling to be born. A world quite different from the one we've known. A world where the rule of law supplants the rule of the jungle. A world in which nations recognize the shared responsibility for freedom and justice.
100 generations have searched for this elusive path to peace. Indeed, in plain sight, the ages-old idea of the global commons and new order is displayed for all to hear. What more honest and carefully procured words than elusive path to peace and deceptive nature of the collectivist world peace goals of the establishing powers? The unattainable, unsustainable, illogical fantasies of a utopian global citizenry, Bacon's New Atlantis, Plato's Republic, and Damien's democracy. Fascinating how they wrap it in a perfect and delicate little package for all to consume and concur, whilst strategically disguising war and slavery with the words peace and freedom. Many put this idea of New World Order on the shoulders of H.W. Bush, but in fact, and even by his own words, some would say even as far back as the days of Nimrod. Essentially, when one understands the development of this order, the motives and spirit behind it, they can gather that H.W. was little more than a foot soldier on the front lines, an aristopet, a water fetcher for the so-called big boys. Oh, but little Georgie isn't getting off that easy. Not only did he play a lead role in the fundamentals of 20th century globalism, he wholeheartedly earned his pet name, Poppy Bush, and he had his hands deeply placed in much more devilry than the American people have been led to believe. If history has been written by the victors, truth will be presented by the watchful. But what are those Bush family ties that have seemed to operate under the radar, or at least have gone rarely discussed in the whole mainstream NWO CIA conspiracy circles? We will attempt to reveal some of these lesser-known angles of the Bush dynasty. A few key families that have played the part right beside them, and the orchestrated deceptions that they would collude in to acquire all-out natural and human resource dominance. But H.W. Bush is merely an heir of his 20th century power structure. In order to start this assessment properly, it would benefit our understanding if we begin with the pioneer of this historical Bush family operation, and that is none other than Prescott Sheldon Bush. Prescott Sheldon Bush, born in 1895, was an American banker and politician. After working as a Wall Street executive investment banker, he represented Connecticut in the United States Senate from 1952 to 1963. He is the father of President George H.W. Bush and grandfather of President George W. Bush. Now that you have heard the cookie-cutter American history description, let's fill in the spaces. Prescott Bush, a towering man of charisma and serpentine charm, was the pioneer of the Bush family dynasty. And though he was considered of presidential candidate potential, he secured his power and pride by way of clandestine international banking firms and oil investment. Like his son George and grandson George W., he went to Yale University and also pioneered the line of Skull and Bones membership that his offspring would later acquire. Prescott would marry Dorothy Walker, daughter of tycoon George Herbert Walker, father-in-law to H.W. Bush, and the source of his given name. Clearly, George Herbert Walker was a huge inspiration to Prescott, and we will get right into the specific reasons why in a minute. To get the full scope of Prescott's beginning, we must address the first family tie to the Bushes. We will start with the Harriman family, namely E.H. Harriman. A shrewd businessman and railroad baron, similar to Prescott Bush's father, Samuel Bush, E.H. Harriman was also a banker, getting his start by way of the Rothschild Jekyll Island Seed Money Group, also known as the Millionaires Club, along with infamous families like the Vanderbilts, Morgans, and Rockefellers. E.H. Harriman would eventually create an investment firm for his son Averell, W.A. Harriman and Company, in New York City. E.H. Harriman would also hire a bulldog of a man to run his operation. As we had mentioned earlier, George Herbert Walker was the man for the job. An already made man by way of family slave ownership wealth of Maryland, a descendant of British slave trader Thomas Walker, Jesuit boarding school trained, former heavyweight boxer, and alcoholic, George Herbert Walker was an extremely successful man by Western standards, and capitalized on his many family-acquired international banking contacts. Aside many of his multi-medium ventures in business, Walker headed his very own G.H. Walker and Company Bank, of course, until E.H. Harriman hired him to run the new venture and operation W.A. Harriman and Company. Walker was a good friend and near servant to the Harriman family. He was well known for chaperoning them to outings, especially horse races. The Harrimans were avid horse breeders and deeply invested in gene development and genetic sciences, which will bring us to their involvement in early American eugenics. So what was it about Mr. Walker that Prescott Bush would appreciate so deeply? Was it the mere fact that he was the father of his wife? Well, it would seem a portion of it might have to do with the fact that George Herbert Walker is the one that gave Prescott his very first break into the banking and natural resource industries. Now reaching the mid-1920s and the peak of the formation of international banking cabal, Walker hired Prescott as VP of W.A. Harriman and Company. Averell Harriman, E.H. Harriman's oldest son and brain behind the operation, would also hire his little brother on the team, Roland, Prescott Bush's good friend and society mate in the Order of Skull and Bones, class of 1917. Here we find the beginning of the Harriman and Bush family tie. It is well known that under the Harriman Banking Group and other banking firms like Union Banking Company, Prescott would directly assist in the proliferation of the Third Reich in Germany, beginning with the overseeing of the Tyson accounts of W.A. Harriman. Fritz Tyson, that is, a staunch Nazi supporter and Hitler financier, would utilize Bush and Harriman as American satellites and piggy banks for the homegrown Hitler project. Prescott Bush would go on to participate in racketeering, bank fraud, and natural resource black markets until the end of the war, where he somehow finds a way to escape scot-free and land himself comfortably in American politics, where he would become state senator, alongside his equally dubious superior, Averell Harriman, the money and the muscle, who would go on to become the prestigious governor of New York. Since it is covered often, we will not deal with the clear Bush and Nazi Germany goings-on. Instead, we will focus on a deeper issue that the Bush family and their partners spent decades constructing within the American society, and that is American eugenics. Prescott's earliest engagements with eugenic philosophies was during his time at Yale University. There he was a diligent member of the Mental Hygiene Society in 1908. This society would later be organized into the World Federation of Mental Health by partner eugenicist Montague Norman, another dubious figure that we will discuss in a bit. During this time, Norman and Prescott Bush elected as new Federation chairman, yes, John Rawlings Rees, director of the Tavistock Psychiatric Clinic, chief psychiatrist and psychological warfare expert for the British Intelligence Services. Here we see the direct Tavistock and Bush eugenics connection, the first step into Bush family eugenics multi-tier operations. The World Federation of Hygiene was one of the earliest American eugenics organizations, and Prescott not only assisted in its formation, but he also was the director of the Federation's branch in his native Connecticut, under Tavistock tutelage. So what was the earliest Harriman connection regarding eugenics? Along with Prescott, the Harrimans had their hands in the idea of race purification, also known as negative eugenics. Both Harriman and Bush dealt with negative eugenics specifically, which is the removal of the termed unfit by way of sterilization of mental patients, execution of the insane and the criminal, and the terminally ill. The idea of race purification by prevention of births to parents from so-called inferior blood stock. Here you will find the works of the Mental Hygiene Society of Prescott, plus euthanasia societies and birth societies that will later be known as Planned Parenthood, all of which the Bushes and Harrimans will have direct influence on. The early practices of American eugenics were clearly based in negative eugenics, opposed to positive eugenics, which focuses on the increased production of so-called good genetic profiles, or the promotion of healthy people increasing their reproduction statuses. In other words, instead of focusing on what's bad and its removal, the focus is shifted to what is deemed good and its growth. Back to the Harrimans. Interestingly, it was not so much E.H. Harriman's interest in eugenics as much as it was his wife, a pioneer of the American Eugenics Society, Mary Williamson Averill, wife to E.H. Harriman and director of the Eugenics Record Office in 1910. A branch of the Galton National Laboratory in London, Mary Harriman was an early architect of the race science movement in America, directly influencing her son Averill Harriman to continue the family philosophies alongside the efforts of Prescott and the Bushes. By 1929, the Depression hits and Harriman and Company strategically merged with the London firm Brown Shipley, the British family investment firm of earlier mentioned eugenicist Montague Norman, forming the Banking and Race Science Alliance. This merger would eventually produce the infamous blood money group Brown Brothers Harriman. By 1931, Brown Brothers Harriman was one of the largest private investment banks in the United States. Prescott Bush was its managing director. So what's another family tie that needs to be addressed in this line of blood and bread? Well, how about the lesser-known Draper family? First, we begin with William H. Draper Jr., and as usual, his introduction to the order out of chaos operation is through banking. Draper Jr. first entered the scene via the Dillon Reed and Company Investment Bank in New York, one of many New York and London finance firms that handled the Tyson accounts, German Steel Trust, and of course, the Hitler Project. Draper Jr. worked directly with Tyson, Prescott, Averill, and Walker finance contacts to raise money for his eugenic project ideas, namely the Holy National and International Racial Hygienic Mission. And in 1932, William Draper Jr. financed the International Eugenics Congress. Here, Draper Jr. also helped to appoint infamous Nazi eugenicist Dr. Ernst Brunin as chief of the World Eugenics Movement. And in line with the Bushes and the Harrimans, Draper Jr. succeeded to flow from banking and negative eugenics to, of course, American politics. After several years of service via the North Atlantic Alliance Council and think tank with Averill Harriman, and now General Draper Jr., in 1958 he was appointed chairman of a committee which was to advise President Eisenhower on international U.S. military aid, planting him in the perfect spot to inject his eugenic philosophy into an already genetically preoccupied U.S. government, and moreover, revitalizing the eugenicist efforts of Prescott's World Federation of Mental Health and Harriman's Draper International Eugenics Project of the 1930s. Now working directly under Eisenhower and deeply within the U.S. government, we watch the story unfold. Here is when the magnum force is truly created. Draper, along with Prescott, Averill Harriman, and joined by the Dulles brothers and Gordon Gray, whom we will mention again later, all joined forces to shape the ultimate and largest population control and social engineering project that has ever hit the United States. But before we get into that, let's flesh out some of Draper's accomplishments. Though Eisenhower would go on to discourage Draper's eugenic fantasies, Draper would continue on to found the eugenic propaganda group named the Population Crisis Committee, funded and promoted by, of course, the Rockefeller and DuPont funding machine, as well as Draper's very own Draper Fund. Here, through the guidance of the Prescott-Harriman regime, these efforts would systematically promote the idea of eugenics and Malthusian remedies to population control. Even later, under Lyndon B. Johnson, General Draper Jr. advised on the subject of eugenics as an addition to the globalist social programs of LBJ's Great Society projects, and directly began financing birth control to inner cities and the Third World through the Agency for International Development, also known as USAID. Very similar to the work of NGO groups like UNICEF. Draper emphatically promoted the idea of reacting to the population explosion by incrementally depopulating the poorer countries via eugenic covert operations, since its unhinged nature was dangerous to the national security of the US. Very Bill Gates-ish and Kissinger-esque indeed. As a family friend and business partner to Prescott Bush, Draper Jr. would heavily influence Prescott's son and soon to come to power H.W. Bush, and bring him into the push for eugenics through the Malthusian, Club of Rome, and Green Movement rhetorical population bomb thesis. In fact, and further down the line, in 1980, Draper Jr.'s son, William H. Draper III, was co-chairman for finance and chief of fundraising for H.W. Bush. With H.W. later in office, the Draper III funneling Operation Money, they were successful in heading up the old depopulation eugenics of their fathers into the UN and throughout the world. In an interview in 1991, an official with the USAID's Population Office, Joanne Grassi, quotes, U.S. Agency for International Development says that surgical sterilization is the Bush administration's first choice method of population reduction in the Third World. Interesting, and one could gather that not only sterilization was involved with these programs. It would also be important to note that around this time precisely is when the scientific development and push for compulsory vaccination began. H.W. Bush rarely had original ideas nor independent direction. Though we will get deeper into his story, we must first understand the families and philosophies that has shaped his generation, and moreover, his familial motivations. By way of the Harriman and Walker power families, Prescott Bush was conjured for duty, and through Prescott, the multipolar globalist dynasty philosophy would carry on. But before we get into the late H.W. and his efforts, we must address the third family tie in the line of question and assessment. And that is the notorious eugenics bloodline, the Gray family, namely Gordon Gray, the hand that rocks the cradle.